If your tomato plants are struggling every time the summer heat arrives, then there is a good chance you are trying to save them in the very way that is slowly ruining your harvest. I see people rushing outside in the middle of a hot afternoon with a hose thinking they are helping their plants. But a few days later, the flowers begin to fall, the leaves start curling, and the fruit stays small. It feels like the sun is winning no matter how much work you put in. I made the same mistake years ago, and I kept blaming the weather until an older gardener looked at my plants and quietly told me that tomatoes do not lose because of heat alone. They lose because we panic and start changing everything at exactly the wrong time. That simple conversation changed the way I grow tomatoes, and I have never forgotten it. Today, I want to share those same old methods with you because they are simple, they cost almost nothing, and they can help your plants stay productive even during the hottest weeks of summer. You do not need expensive products or complicated systems. You only need to understand what your tomato plants are asking for before they become stressed. Most people notice the damage only after it has already started, but there are quiet signs that appear much earlier if you know where to look. Once you recognize those signs, you can protect your harvest before flowers begin dropping and before the fruit stops growing. That alone can make the difference between a few tomatoes and baskets full of healthy fruit. I still remember the first season when I stopped fighting the heat and started working with it instead. My plant stayed greener, my tomatoes ripened more evenly, and I spent less money and less time trying to fix problems that never appeared in the first place. Many people never discover this because they believe bigger effort always means better results. But sometimes the smartest thing you can do is one small step at the right moment. In the next few minutes, I will show you exactly what that first step is because without it, every other trick becomes much less effective. And this is where almost everyone makes the biggest mistake. The first thing I had to learn was that a tomato plant does not think the way we do. When the air becomes extremely hot, the plant is not trying to grow bigger or make more tomatoes. It is simply trying to stay alive. That is why so many flowers suddenly dry up and fall to the ground. The plant is saving its strength because it believes difficult days are ahead. Most gardeners see those falling flowers and immediately reach for more fertilizer or start watering several times a day. I understand that feeling because I used to do exactly the same thing. The strange part was that every extra thing I added only seemed to make the problem worse. The soil stayed wet, the roots became weaker, and the tomatoes never recovered the way I expected. An older friend once watched me carrying bucket after bucket of water during the hottest afternoon of July, and he smiled before saying that tomatoes do not need panic. They need consistency. I never forgot those words because they explained years of disappointment in one simple sentence. The biggest mistake happens when we keep changing our routine every time the weather forecast shows another heat wave. Tomatoes love steady conditions much more than constant attention. Their roots want moisture deep below the surface instead of little drinks every few hours. Their leaves need to stay healthy instead of being soaked with water under a burning sun. Many people believe that watering the leaves cools the plant, but in reality it often creates more stress and can lead to unnecessary problems. I also learned that the hottest part of the day is the worst time to make decisions in the garden because everything looks tired. Even healthy plants may have slightly curled leaves in the afternoon and then recover completely after sunset. If you react too quickly, you may create problems that were never there in the first place. That is why I always tell people to look at their tomatoes early in the morning. That is when the plant tells you the truth. If the leaves are fresh and standing naturally, then the roots are usually doing their job. But if the plant already looks weak before the sun becomes strong, then it is asking for help. In the next part, I will show you the first simple step that changed everything for me, and it costs almost nothing, but most gardeners still ignore it. Dot. The first change I made was so simple that I almost laughed at myself for ignoring it all those years. Instead of trying to cool the whole plant, I started protecting the soil. Most people spend all their attention looking at the leaves while the real battle is happening around the roots. When the sun keeps beating down on bare ground hour after hour, the soil becomes hotter than most people realize. The moisture disappears much faster, and the roots begin to struggle even before the leaves show any warning. An old gardener showed me this many years ago. He walked over to two tomato plants growing side by side. One had bare soil and the other was covered with a layer of dry grass and old straw. He pushed his hand into the ground under both plants and asked me to do the same. The difference surprised me immediately. Under the bare soil, the ground felt hot and dry just a few inches below the surface. Under the mulch, the soil was cool, slightly damp, and full of life. That was the day I understood why some gardens survive long heat waves while others slowly fall apart. Since then, I never leave the soil uncovered once summer arrives. I use whatever is available. Ever dry grass without seed, old straw, shredded leaves, or even untreated cardboard covered with a little compost all work well. You do not need to spend money because the goal is simply to stop the sun from baking the soil every single day. Many people skip this because they think mulch is only for saving water, but it does much more than that. It keeps the root zone cooler, slows down evaporation, and gives the plant a much steadier environment. Tomatoes love stability, and this old method quietly provides it every hour of the day without any extra work from you. Another mistake I often see is placing the mulch right against the stem. I always leave a small gap around the base of the plant so air can circulate and the stem stays dry. It is a tiny detail, but it can prevent unnecessary problems later in the season. After only a few days, I usually notice that the soil stays moist much longer, and I do not need to water nearly as often. That alone saves time, saves water, and keeps the plants calmer during the hottest weeks. But there is another simple habit that works together with mulch and makes an even bigger difference when temperatures stay high for many days in a row. Most gardeners overlook it even though it costs absolutely nothing, and I will show you exactly how I do it next. Now that the soil is protected, the next habit becomes much more effective. And this is where I see many gardeners making the same mistake every summer. They water too often but never deeply enough. The surface looks wet for a little while, so they feel they have done enough, but only the top layer receives moisture while the deeper roots stay dry. After a few days, the tomato plant becomes dependent on those light waterings and its roots remain close to the surface where the heat is strongest. That makes the plant weaker every time another hot day arrives. Years ago, an older neighbor told me something that stayed with me ever since. He said to water the roots, not the calendar. At first, I did not fully understand what he meant, but after watching my plants for several seasons, I realized he was absolutely right. Instead of watering every day because that felt safe, I began checking the soil first. I pushed my finger a couple of inches below the mulch, and if the soil still felt slightly moist, I simply waited. When it finally became dry below the surface, I watered slowly and deeply early in the morning before the sun became strong. I never rushed this part. I let the water soak into the ground instead of running across the surface. Sometimes I watered in 2 slow rounds with a short pause between them, so every drop had time to reach the deeper roots. Within a couple of weeks, I noticed something interesting. The plant stayed fresh much longer during the afternoon, and they recovered faster after extremely hot days. Their roots had learned to grow deeper where the soil stayed cooler and moisture lasted longer. That old habit saved me both water and effort, because I was watering less often but getting much better results. Another simple trick that few people use is placing a small bucket or plastic bottle with several tiny holes beside the plant and burying it so only the top remains above the soil. When I pour water into that container, it slowly reaches the roots instead of evaporating from the surface. It is an old method that costs almost nothing and works surprisingly well during long periods of heat. The leaves stay drier, the soil remains evenly moist, and the plant experiences much less stress. Once I combined deep watering with good mulch, I realized there was still one more mistake that had been quietly reducing my harvest for years. Most people never notice it because it happens above the plant instead of below it, and that is exactly what I want to show you next. There was one lesson that took me much longer to learn because I always believed more sunlight had to mean more tomatoes. That sounds reasonable until you live through a week when the temperature stays extremely high, day after day. During those periods, the afternoon sun can become so intense that even healthy plants begin to struggle. I used to stand in the garden looking at curled leaves, and I thought my tomatoes needed even more water. Sometimes I watered twice in one day and still watched flowers fall to the ground. Then an older gardener showed me something that seemed almost too simple. He stretched a piece of light shade cloth above his tomato row, just high enough to soften the strongest afternoon sun without blocking the morning light. The plants still received plenty of sunshine, but they no longer had to fight through the hottest hours alone. I tried the same idea using materials I already had at home. Some years I used shade cloth, and other years I even used an old white bed sheet, supported by simple wooden stakes. The goal was never to keep the plants in the shade all day. The goal was only to reduce the stress during the hottest part of the afternoon. The difference surprised me. The leaves stayed firmer. More flowers remained on the plants instead of dropping. The fruit continued growing instead of slowing down every time another heat wave arrived. Many people think this is only useful in very hot climates, but I have found it helpful whenever temperatures remain unusually high for several days in a row. Another mistake I often notice is removing too many leaves because people want every tomato to receive direct sunlight. I understand why they do it, but tomatoes actually need some of their own leaves for protection. Those leaves act like small umbrellas that reduce the chance of sun scald on the fruit. Tomatoes that are suddenly exposed to intense sunlight can develop pale patches that later become damaged and unattractive. I only remove leaves that are old, damaged, or touching the soil. Healthy leaves stay where they are because they continue feeding the plant while also protecting the fruit. It is one of those quiet old habits that costs nothing but often saves a large part of the harvest. Once I stopped trying to expose every tomato to full sun and started helping the plant protect itself, I noticed stronger growth and healthier fruit. But there is one final habit that brings all these methods together and helps tomato plants continue producing long after many gardens begin slowing down. Dot. The last habit that tied everything together for me was learning that healthy tomato plants do not need constant interference. They need regular attention and small adjustments before problems become serious. I used to walk into the garden only when something looked wrong. By then, I was always trying to fix damage that had already happened. Today, I spend just a few quiet minutes every morning looking at my plants before the day becomes hot. I check the color of the leaves. I look for new flowers. I touch the soil under the mulch. I make sure the stems are standing strong and that no fruit is lying on the ground. Those few minutes tell me almost everything I need to know. If I notice a small problem early, it usually takes only a simple correction to keep the plant growing well. One habit that has helped me for years is removing only the damaged or yellow leaves that no longer help the plant. I never strip away large amounts of healthy growth because every healthy leaf is making energy for future tomatoes. At the same time, I make sure the lower leaves are not touching the soil because that improves air movement and helps keep the plant cleaner during humid weather. Another forgotten method I still use is feeding the soil instead of chasing quick results with strong fertilizers. A little finished compost around the base of each plant every few weeks gives steady nutrition without forcing soft growth that suffers during extreme heat. It costs almost nothing if you make your own compost, and it continues improving the soil season after season. I have found that slow, steady growth always produces stronger plants than sudden bursts of growth, followed by stress. Many gardeners think they need a different product every time the weather changes, but most of the time, the answer is already in the garden. Healthy soil, careful watering, simple mulch, and a little patience solve more problems than expensive bottles ever will. Every season reminds me that tomatoes reward consistency far more than perfection. Even when the weather becomes difficult, the plants respond surprisingly well if their roots stay cool. Their moisture remains steady, and they are not pushed beyond what they can handle. There is still one final idea I want to leave with you because it changed the way I think about every growing season. Once you understand it, you stop worrying about every heat wave and start feeling confident that your tomato plants can keep producing long after many other gardens begin to struggle. When I look back at all the summers I have spent growing tomatoes, I realize that the biggest lesson was never about finding a miracle product or some expensive new system. It was about understanding what the plant really needs when the weather becomes difficult. Once I stopped fighting nature and started helping the plant through the hottest days, everything became easier. The soil stayed cooler because it was covered. The roots became stronger because they received deep watering instead of little splashes every day. The leaves protected the fruit instead of being removed too early. A little afternoon shade during extreme heat saved flowers that would have been lost before. Small daily observations helped me solve tiny problems before they turned into large ones. None of these methods are expensive, and none of them require special equipment. Most of them were shown to me by people who had been growing food long before modern gardening products filled the store shelves. Those gardeners relied on simple habits because they worked year after year. That is why I still trust them today. If you begin using even a few of these ideas, you will probably notice that your tomatoes stay healthier during heat waves and continue producing long after many other plants begin slowing down. There will always be seasons with difficult weather because none of us can control the sun or the temperature. What we can control is how prepared our plants are before those hot days arrive. That preparation is often the difference between disappointment and a harvest you can proudly share with family and friends. Every basket of fresh tomatoes reminds me that simple methods practiced consistently almost always beat complicated solutions used only once. I hope these ideas help you enjoy your garden with less worry and more confidence because growing food should bring peace instead of stress. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I truly appreciate every minute you have watched. If this video gave you even one useful idea, I would be grateful if you shared it with someone who loves gardening as much as you do. And before you head back to your garden, remember that there is another old growing method that very few people use today, but it has helped me harvest healthier tomatoes for many years. I will share that story in the next video, and I think it may surprise you even more than this one did.